Hello and welcome to Entangled, the podcast where we explore the science of consciousness, the true nature of reality, and what it means to be a spiritual being having a human experience. I'm your host, Jordan Euclid, and today I'm joined by my longtime friend and fraternity brother, Alex Blunk. In this episode, we talk about our love for music, his new business, Mother Nature, experimenting with psychedelic mushrooms, and the future of virtual reality. Next, we talk about Bruce Lipton, who's challenged widely accepted views of conventional science, as well as how Darwin's theory of evolution became famous so quickly back in the day to justify European imperialism and power structures. No further from our experiences in present day, we talk about the rapid changes we're currently experiencing because of technology. VR, robots, artificial intelligence, and how we can adapt to these changes. We then talk about the huge inequality gap in wealth distribution, making it difficult for ordinary people and small businesses to compete and break out of the poverty cycle. We end the discussion on the integrity of technology and whether the US is as free as it is portrayed to be. Outros available for this and all episodes at entangledpodcast.substack.com. Please enjoy. Without further ado, Alex, why don't you tell the folks about yourself?
Yeah, and Jordan, I think we'll always generally be linked by, our music taste. I think that, early on, especially in college, you introduced me to, a lot of just incredible hip hop groups, namely The Roots. I can, always give you credit for introducing me to the gentleman of Questlove and, Common, Mos Def. I mean, can't thank you enough. And it's been fun to, progress in our friendship. And, now we're just kind of looking out for UAPs and, thinking about how mycelium, travels through the ground. So, but yeah, so, I think a little bit of background on myself. I grew up in Colorado and a little bit in mainly Chicagoland. Pretty fairly nuclear, supportive family. Lots of baseball, playing the trumpet, lots of free time to kind of tinker and mess around with anything really mechanical. Like you said, we were educated down at the fine college of IU. I was in a consulting track, but largely just kind of fell into early stage startups early on, at least from a professional sense. This is kind of my background. It's kind of funny when you think about how people describe, themselves when they're asked to introduce, because I feel like men really, tied to that, what you do is kind of who you are. Yeah. And so outside of school, dabbled in, kind of the e-commerce outdoor industry. I was in crowdfunding for a minute, took a hard left and got into craft beer. I was there for about 5 years, and then now took another hard left, and now I'm in alternative foods, namely chickpea based flour foods. And also have a little side project that blends, motorcycle riding and essential oils. So, there's just on a personal side, a little bit about myself. But yeah, excited to kind of peel back the layers here with you, Jordan.
Hell yeah. You mentioned that you recently started a side project blending motorcycle riding and essential oils. What products have you created, and how did you come up with that idea?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think that most people wouldn't think that motorcycle riding and the nose are very related, but I can tell you, after being a rider for a little under 10 years, they are. And, I generally experimented a lot while commuting via motorcycle, and would take essential oils from Mandy's collection and shout out Chill Pill, and would drop them in the front of my full face helmet. And, the reason I was doing this is basically to not only, sure, it makes your helmet smell better, but I think that just framing your mind to prepare it for what it's about to kind of embark on is really important. I think that the ensuring that you are kind of in the state of calm or zen or whatever you want to call it right before you get into this experience of exhilaration and danger and is very important. And I think anything you can do to prepare your brain to be in a good place while you're riding is incredibly important. So over the last year, we have been creating a concept and legitimizing the kind of experiment that I had into a kit that you can install into your full face helmet right in front of the vent, and it effectively diffuses essential oils while you're riding. So it's been fun. The concept is being received really well. We got a lot of interest and sales are picking up, and it's been a fun little project to be a part of.
That's awesome. And so then transitioning into the world of music, has that always been important to you?
Yeah, I'd say, the earliest kind of spiritual encounters I'd have were tied to music. I remember as a kid, watching my grandma and my mom just up there, me, little pipsqueak, looking at them, thinking, damn, they were really enjoying this. Like, and I remember them not necessarily being that religious, but watching the power of them and my mom just like tearing up and all these memories flooding into her mind, as a kid, this was very impactful to me. And then when I grew up a little bit, or got a little bit older, I played in a brass choir that was, largely playing in the church, and, seeing the same kind of reaction from my, the matriarchs of my family. And just, as I was, trying my best to, do a good job on that instrument. But yeah, so, I think that's generally, at least from a personal standpoint, seeing my, again, like I said, the matriarchs of my family, really have this deep connection to music. And then you see from an external standpoint, seeing the likes of, like I mentioned, Questlove, and, you see Aretha Franklin, you have these, deep connections with artists that, you wouldn't necessarily like. I am just fascinated by it, and I think that music is one of those dimensions that really does transcend any sort of. Like, you don't even have to know what they're saying to enjoy it. Which is, think about that for a second, So, but yeah, and I think, and that's even apart from the side of what how music is tied to humans at their core nature. This goes back to even the more nomadic and tribal times of humans. So, but yeah, I'd say that's, why music is important to me. But obviously, and I know you side with this, the music is one of those things that's almost hard to talk about because you have so many genres that you enjoy, and it is definitely a very unique and kind of carnal version of art as it is.
When you talk about listening to artists like Questlove or Aretha Franklin, I think one of the things that's so great about music is it's very much like an author writing a book, in the sense that it really just lets you transport into their experience, and music can tell a story in a way and let us connect with one another in a way that we just wouldn't be able to through spoken word alone.
Yeah, that's a good point. You saying that too. Is I was reading something by James Murphy over at LCD Sound System, and he was saying, yes, there's definitely a story. Literally there are lyrics, but in terms of breaking down stories into like, what did you mean when you wrote that song? He said, once you have to kind of, break down the meaning literally to, maybe a music blog or whatnot, it really breaks it, it loses its meaning. Mm-hmm. Meaning is, sure, there are lyrics that, they're trying to get a point across, but it is one of those things that you just kind of, it's a very personal journey. You listen to a song, it's how it makes you feel. If it doesn't do anything for you, you move on. You find a song that puts a groove in your step. But it's or if there's something deeper there, that makes you tear up or misty eyed. Like I was saying with my mom and grandma. Those are all tied to probably memories that they had as kids. And I know it's music is one of those things that, or generally like all art forms. I came from, a very artistic family. My grandpa is a, 97-year-old artist whipping up paintings and has been a sculptor all his life. And and then my aunt was also, in the arts community in Boston. It's incredible to watch the mediums in which artists can create and communicate these feelings that are very, I think words fail. You really, you're digging, if you're doing it in a genuine, honest sense, you're digging into it and creating it from a place of, pure authenticity or a lot of times pain.
And when you talk about how your family members would have these spiritual experiences with music and you felt connected to that, did you get that same experience ever during the rest of your sermon at church?
No, I'd say, my most, the closest I ever got to, at least being as excited and stoked about church as I was, it was not in music. It was actually not going to church. I didn't really get it. I didn't really, I didn't understand it. I didn't really, see the value in it. And, and I think that's a blessing or not a blessing. I'd say it's a privilege that, you're not necessarily aware of until you're a little bit older in life, where you see, oh, wow, you see why religion is so powerful and important for people and communities across the world, especially, those who want to get outside of the world that they are in. So I think that was a pretty, narrow viewpoint, at least in my early kind of relationship with spirituality and religion.
Interesting. And how has that relationship with spirituality and religion changed over time?
As I got older, the kind of, introduction through my partner, she really introduced me to an incredible set of, yoga teachers when we were living in California. And that was, it just really made me think, okay, maybe, Christianity, not necessarily for me. At least, from how I understood it then. But then seeing these teachers, seeing, the messages and the lessons that they were portraying, and then mixed in with the kind of physicality of it, and being very connected to your mind, connecting your mind and body, it really kind of sparked something where, oh wow, this is an incredible practice. This is an area of thought that I haven't really dabbled in before. So and then also kind of tying it a little bit back to work, right before I kind of went through this and learned more about the kind of yoga practice. I was working in a job that was, putting me at wit's end with kind of physical and mental exhaustion. And, you start to think, damn, there's got to be, you start to think, wow, is your purpose in this world, to be kind of a cog in a wheel, or, do you want to, make an impact that's less, not necessarily, you just want to make sure that you're on a path that's not going to burn you out. I'd say, whatever that is, it can be, you could be digging ditches all the way up to the president of the United States, as long as you understand that, this is kind of this is your path, and this is where you are kind of meant to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And what are some of the ways that you've been able to identify your path along the way?
Yeah. So, I think the one thing that's stuck with me is, at least, coming out of business school, and a lot of like my friend groups, you do things, you do a job, in order to make money, to achieve success, and, to make an impact. And then, that money allows you to buy things, and achieve status and go on fancy trips and buy cool cars. And then then you're allowed to actually kind of be and, and kind of understand who you are. And I'd say, that's just something, I was reading recently, where what you should do is, it's less about, connecting with what you are doing. You actually start off with, understanding who you are, what drives you, what makes you tick. And then you go down, like you said, go down that path and do the actual thing that that's calling you, that is, tied to kind of, what you feel, you feel like this is your place in the world. And then ultimately like the getting things and the having and the travel kind of come last. So it's just this kind of flipped. I honestly, just on the idea of finding, more purpose and finding that path is, just not tying a lot of value to, what I do in terms of like my own personal value, and connecting with, people who are close to me. And honestly, I know it's, maybe, it's kind of overused today, but staying present is much harder than anybody gives it credit for. And I think that I've honestly, I felt like I've that in alone will guide you so well. Every job that I've ever taken was as a result of, really learning and listening to a lot of people, and understanding where the opportunities are, and just knowing when to kind of commit myself and dive in. And so, staying present is honestly the biggest tool that any brain or any person can have to, at least for me personally, finding the right path. And just, taking care of your, the people who are, your friends and family, they are generally your anchors. And so, you listen, and like I mentioned, the matriarchs of my family and my dad and grandpa have all been kind of these anchors in my life. And I think that they're important to actually, to listen to and to connect with, and they provide roots to your experience. But they, to me, they don't necessarily guide you where you go, but they do ground you in a sense. And yeah, remember them, always mentioning, don't forget who you are, and and understanding that they're the support net that any human needs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that sense of community is something that was lost for a lot of people during the pandemic, and part of
I was going to say,
it was so hard.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I know we a good buddy and I, speaking of kind of staying connected over distances, we created a little kind of vinyl swap where, we decided on a genre every month, and he would send me, an album that he thought that I would enjoy. And then I as well, but we would, wouldn't tell each other what it was. And so it would just show up. And this is early pandemic. We did it all of 2020. And so then, at one point throughout the month, you get this, mysterious square box, and you'd crack it open, and it's just, cool way to kind of spark conversation and obviously listen to some good music. And it's, and then, also, being able to, digitally connect with people like we're doing now, I think that's the incredible part about this time. Obviously, there's tremendous sadness and loss, but there's also for me personally, I'm a pretty big nerd. So, watching these business models and technologies advance as fast as they did over the pandemic has been pretty incredible. It's a marker in human achievement, and watching all of these kind of causes bubble up and show the kind of both the incredible side of the human experience, but also the dark side and scary side and oppressive side.
Are there any emerging technologies or softwares that are getting you really excited?
Just to watch all the convergences now, the kind of, more decentralized cryptocurrencies and Web3, and just generally decentralized platforms in general, combining with VR, it's almost like, futurists have to be very giddy right now, because all of these things are coalescing. And and then also macroeconomic conditions like the wealth gap and globalization, and all these things are coming together that, I would be shocked if something like, Ready Player One wasn't online within the next 5 years. I know that it's, the metaverse is obviously trying to pop forward, and I don't, and I've been talking about it with, my partner and my friends, and, is it a good thing? Where's it going to go? I think it's just fascinating to watch, all of these people really kind of dig in, and, I don't know where it's going to go, but it is going to could be a fun ride. Hopefully we can learn from our mistakes in the analog world. I think another thing, from a technology standpoint, is all of these ways that we are kind of re-plugging ourselves back into ecosystems and trying to speak the language of animals and speak the language of plants, and through conservation techniques. I don't necessarily know of, other than the incredible work of, say, like mycoremediation, where, mushrooms are being installed to like clean up toxic grounds, and all sorts of like ways that the people are just reconnecting and taking nature more seriously. Because I feel like over the last, couple hundred years, we've largely just kind of tried to remove ourselves from the food chain, and that's had some pretty lasting impact. So, watching these technologies bubble up. I'd say, I just got back from a big food conference in Anaheim called Expo West, and one of the most fascinating things that's coming up to me, related to kind of mushrooms, is these plant-based foods. And most people have heard of, Beyond and Impossible Foods, but there's this new meat that just launched that's, I believe it's called Meaty, but they're growing alternative, quote unquote plant-based meat, but mushrooms kind of outside of plant, but it's they're growing meats out of mycelium fiber and growing them into these forms, so that it's not necessarily like, a plant trying to fake like it's ground beef, which is always kind of a little funny to me. It's actually, kind of a fibrous texture, and it's supposed to mirror, the muscle fibers of, say, chicken or beef or steak. And, with obviously all the data is there, where it's from a water consumption standpoint, from a nutritional standpoint, it all checks the boxes, and it's so I think that's going to be a fun space to watch. Specifically.
Yeah, totally. Well, and you talk about how there's this growing sense of interconnectedness with nature, and as we've talked in the past about consciousness, and the idea that consciousness could be much, broader than what we typically tend to think of it. I mean, do you ever think it's possible that nature's almost like fighting back, or not fighting back, but letting us know, like, we got to stop destroying her?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually that it's a good point you bring that up. It reminds me of a quote in this book I was reading, and it brought up the fact that humans are always in competition with trees for space and water and resources, specifically forests and development. Trees, if you think about them as beings, are, it's just visually, that's pretty fascinating. But, we are in competition with them. They are at least from a terrestrial, like a land-based being, one of the bigger ones that we, encounter on a daily basis. And we're constantly kind of in battle with them. We're cutting them down. We are, deforesting. We are, killing off these ecosystems. But the thing is, sure, we can win that battle, but in the end, we are the ones ending up losing. The trees are the glue to, a lot of what's going on. But so to your point, I don't necessarily think that nature can tell us that, hey, we're really fucking up, other than, the entire collapse of ecosystems, and that's being felt now. And take this with a grain of salt. I am not an environment. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a biologist. I am a concerned citizen, I would say. A concerned world citizen. And so I think that by the time that nature gives us the ability, or is telling us that, hey, we're really messing up, it's a little bit too late, and we're seeing the ramifications of that now. And so I'd say that's why it's also you remain hopeful to watch this innovation take place in correcting the wrongs of our food system, but you also it can't move fast enough. But I think we both have economic backgrounds, from a schooling standpoint, and it's I'd say that once the utility is there, once the externalities all kind of come together, people can move very fast if they want to. So whether it's going to be force or whether it's going to be by collaboration is kind of up to us.
Yeah. What is it like? Necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So hopefully we figure it out. That's the idea.
Yeah. I'm optimistic. I mean, it's like any type of progress. It sometimes feels like 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but it does feel like we're, I think, hopefully going generally in the right direction. Although and who knows, maybe this was just like a total bullshit meme, but I did see something on Instagram a couple weeks ago that was like, I could not tell if it was a joke or if it was a serious thing. Yeah. But it was like researchers found that by putting VR headsets on cows and having it set to a field where they're grazing, they produced more milk and were happier. And it's got a fucking picture of these 2 cows in these little pens locked up with Oculuses on their face.
Oh.
And I'm like, is this seriously like a legitimate solution that people are proposing? Situation here?
I know. That's bad. I mean, I think that, I was listening to one of your older episodes, and, the faster humans can understand that, there are souls inside of every one of those animals, the faster we understand, the impact of fucked up shit like that. It's you have to understand every animal that, whatever, I know this is more closely tied to more like Eastern religions, but it's like, with the concept of reincarnation and these kind of like circular patterns of, souls kind of transitioning, through life and death. It's, you shouldn't, you should respect even down to the ant. Like, I don't know, just slow down and appreciate, what's in front of you. You don't, but there's a lot of people with a lot of pain in their hearts, and they just need to, that's a tough one. There's, it kind of depends on your perspective, why people mistreat, and I think it's a kind of a lack of because humans have imaginations and language, and all these things are incredible inventions, or not imagination, but languages and technologies. They're incredible inventions in our perspective, but it is like from nature's point of view, they're unnecessary. So now it's kind of up to us. Now we've made all these fancy, shiny things. Now we have to create things that allow us to actually truly communicate with, animals and plants and otherworldly beings, and some, it's probably not going to be technology. We do, like, I'm sure, you've read the brain is an incredible thing, and it has the ability to, change consciousness and perspective and tap into unseen dimensions. Even aside from, psychedelics and these things that can obviously change your state of mind pretty quickly, just think about how powerful even your nose is as a human. Like, you is the only sense that you have that is completely unfiltered. You're taking in these tiny little bits of things in front of you as you're walking throughout the world. And our sense of smell is horrible comparatively to a dog's. I was just watching something last night, whereas, a dog's sense of smell is 100 times better than ours. Their vision is worse than ours, but they can literally, you think about that, the ramifications of that. You can, you're seeing this effectively like 3D imaging just slice of what's in front of you. When, I don't know, I like to just think about that, where you're a city dog walking through Manhattan. Like, what do they think? This has got to be, an odd place. So anyway, we lack the tools to understand and respect all of these, incredible, things that we really take for granted.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's cool when you talk about how dogs experience life. And something I think about too is like, we understand so little about our own consciousness and the way our own mind works. And like, we talk about, how dogs perceive the world and how other animals do, but like, and people tend to, back to the kind of nature consciousness thing, people tend to think of trees as these inanimate objects that have no life, that just kind of, like they're alive, but yet they have no self-awareness or free will. And it's like, how do you know that?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, so just because they operate on a much slower, communication stream, and there's no words, it's it's a super organism. And that's one of the more fascinating things. I forget, I don't know if I was reading somewhere where basically there was a woman over the last few decades that was exposing, the fact that forests and trees are in collaboration, not competition. And they'll, I know it sounds like you've read some stuff about this, but they'll share resources underground. They'll communicate when there's, they're getting infested, or they'll take care of their young. They'll do a lot of things that we do. But they're, from an evolutionary standpoint, not in competition. The forest itself is a living, breathing thing. And so, all the way down to, the soil in like a very healthy forest is its own kind of, ridiculous slice of life. And so the reason I bring that up is because prior to that, people thought that, I don't want to speak for everybody, but largely what everybody, what the idea is that everybody, it's kind of a dog eat dog world. Everyone's resource constrained and only the strongest win. It's a very kind of masculine view of what's going on. And the ramifications of that are pretty fast. And again, I'm an armchair, citizen of the world. So take it with a grain of salt. But in the end, that is, you think about the people who are, generating the research findings and using the language to build these scientific articles. There's a lot of ego behind that, and largely for a very long time, a lot of white males. And so to have better perspectives and more, and less kind of ego-driven, viewpoints on the world allows truths to come through and allows us to actually communicate with nature in a more intimate and more, I'd say, universally collaborative way. So
yeah.
And another thing, it's just like something I was tuning into is there was a researcher who was trying to prove and trying to understand the intelligence of elephants. And so the researcher, hung this big basket of fruit up above their head, out of reach of their trunk, and then put a stick on the ground and assumed that the elephant would pick up the stick and smack the food, and then they would get the food. And, that would prove that they use tools like, there's a few, animals out there that use tools, and that's one marker for success, or that's one marker of intelligence that humans use. But again, that's through the human's perspective. So, and many elephants walked with the stick and just didn't pay any mind, didn't pay attention to the food. And then, so the humans had to kind of think outside the box. They're like, okay, so it's not a stick. So let's put a box or a tire there. And the elephants instantly took the box, put it under the food, took the food, ate it. And then what they figured out is that picking up the stick would have shut off all the receptors in their nose. So the elephants would just be like, why would I ever do that? Why would I shut off this like gigantic organ to be able to see and get the food up above my head? So, the reason I bring that up is that humans largely just don't, we're passing everything through our lens, our perspective, and that, if you can't kind of check your own, ego, or understand that you should, think about other, I don't know, just respect this gigantic, beautiful being more than you should. I don't know, so.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Bruce Lipton?
No, who's that?
You should check him out. He was one of the guys that really was the first stem cell researchers, one of those first guys, and then became like the father of, or one of the fathers of epigenetics, and like the biology of belief, and that there's a quantum field and all of that. He did a really great like walkthrough of our current scientific paradigm and how we got to this, some of the accepted views of conventional science, or whatever you want to call it. And one of the things that he argues is that Darwin's theory of evolution was or at least the one that has been accepted by the mainstream, was just totally wrong, frankly, right? That, evolution isn't one of competition, it's one of cooperation, that we're co-evolving.
Yeah. Okay.
And he also talks about, even look at the subtitle of that book that Darwin published, I think it was like in the 1700s. And it's something like, or the discussion of the inferior races, right? And he makes the argument that a big part of why this theory was picked up so quickly by the power structures of the day is because they helped to justify European imperialism.
More ego-driven decision. I mean, yeah, that's funny you bring that up, is tying these epiphanies you have where you're like, oh, wow, okay, it's not necessarily like, the Illuminati or whatnot, but, like I said, I went to business school. So, coming out of business school, you're taught like that the US can do no wrong, and policy decisions in the best interest of the people, and it's a democratic state, and money is not evil. I mean, obviously I hadn't done my homework. I hadn't formed my own individual opinion on all this, but I was kind of a product of my environment coming out of business school. And I think the first time that I learned, I really was like, damn, this is pretty messed up, was I read this book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins.
Yep.
And oh my God, that was pretty disheartening. I would say coming out of that, finishing that book, just, and those of you who haven't read it, it's basically, he was a really gifted kind of economist, and it's been a bit since I read it. And I know he kind of came out with a couple like updated versions, but he came out of school. He was picture him as kind of like a James Bond of economists. And so he would show up to countries, third world countries, South America largely, and discuss with, world leaders, hey, listen, we'll work on your big capital infrastructure projects. We'll bring these roads, we'll bring these buildings to your cities. We'll make sure that you're paid. We'll make sure that the projects get done. Borrow a little money from the IMF, borrow a little money from XYZ, and we'll make it happen. And largely all of this was doing was over leveraging these third world countries into debt obligations they can never repay. And while all the while having the leaders, these very corrupt leaders, get paid on the side, and just impoverishing, and that was the like economic colonialism, this very dark way to make sure that, these countries stayed in the United States' pocketbook and, kept the, and I don't pretend to know the vastness of all of this, like very, back room, kind of shady, corrupt practice. I'm sure there's much worse things now. But it was one of the first books that it dawned on me that, oh shit, it just made me less patriotic to be, drinking the Kool-Aid as much. And so you asked the question about, at least from a professional sense, how do you find purpose? I think that's also why I like to kind of stay small with businesses and stay close to the founding team, because I can make an impact, and I know the founders, I know our mission, I know, largely how the sausage is made. So, but all small businesses are dependent on large banks and large entities greater than themselves. I understand, it's fascinating to see the interconnectedness in the web of global economies and how, those policy decisions, don't generally align with your personal values. But that's why politics is so messy.
And not even your personal values, right? And you were talking earlier about the inequality gap for wealth, and you think about just the economic system that we have today, and it's all geared towards monopolies and growth and horizontal integration. And so as that continues for the small businesses, it naturally just gets harder and harder to compete. And so for anyone who wants to break out of that poverty cycle, it becomes more and more impossible to do so. And that's why this wealth gap just keeps spiraling in the complete wrong direction.
I had some friends, I'm sure you do too. And, friends who work at, companies like Amazon and Google. And I don't know. I'd say Amazon is more in this camp where trying to kind of horizontally integrate and take over everything from, video streaming to, get that pen. There was a comedian who was telling this joke recently that I heard, where on Amazon you can order a single pen and get it next day in a box. Like, think about the ramifications of that. Just ludicrous business model. I mean, yeah. I love the, from an operations and technological standpoint, that what humans are able to do, but at a certain point you got to be like, why? Like, why did we build that way? Yeah. Why are we, this is so counterintuitive? Where it's Amazon is to me, and I'm a big believer in design thinking, like looking at, the end user and making sure that it's a positive experience for them. But design thinking shouldn't be applied to everything. The end user, especially, you should bring in externalities like the carbon emission impact of this, the labor impact of this decision. It's almost like, why is there only one way? There's two ways to measure a successful customer experience: how fast it gets to your door and how cheap it is. That's ridiculous. There should be at least two other things, to oversimplify it, like carbon emissions and some sort of like happiness quota from those employees who actually have to do that shit. So it's a weird time, because I know that also you got to think the companies are investing in, I'm sure you've seen your fair share of videos, or probably personally toured one, like e-commerce fulfillment warehouse is a very roboticized place. There's bins, there's these, racks flying around, and, I don't know. I used to work on, and some of this, passion is coming from while I worked at the brewery, I was working on the kind of operations and logistics side of the business. And, you really start to empathize and sympathize with the plight of the workers who are doing that job of, moving the heavy things and throwing kegs around and loading trucks and driving the trucks at all hours of the day. And so until you're in that position of, I think most people's most direct connection to some of those jobs would be like being a server, being a waiter. That'll teach you a lot, from a labor standpoint. But I think that physical hard job, physical hard labor, early in life teaches you a lot. And I think more people should, not from a corporate sense, not like, oh, I'm the CEO of this company and I'm going to go, do a ride along for one day. No, it's actually, I don't know, get your hands dirty. It'll do you a lot of good, and you'll understand the ramifications of decisions you make as, being somebody who's in a place of privilege, in place of, having the ability to be in more of a service job. intellectual kind of managerial position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what do you even think is going to be the future of the workforce?
I think there's going to be a lot of kind of hybrid robotics coming out. I think that once, and you asked me what technology is that's really fascinating, intriguing. I think driverless cars is going to be driverless cars, and once the airspace is regulated enough, or they figure out drones. I think drones are going to be very that if you think about, like, a lot of the things that are being delivered via Amazon and stuff right now are very small. So I feel like once those floodgates open, I think drones are going to be pretty commonplace in supply chains and fulfillment, at least like what they call last mile, bringing it from a warehouse to kind of a regional neighborhood. But also, back on driverless cars, I think there's like semi-truck infrastructure is going to be overturned very soon. I wouldn't, once the the insurance and the technology can kind of catch up, driverless semi trucks are going to kind of be, I don't know if you've ever seen, it's just kind of a lame reference, but did you ever see that X-Men, the Wolverine one? I think it's a couple of years ago. They had, that's what it's going to be like. That's such, I've talked to a few people in that space with, autonomous semi trucks and trailers. And that's getting from point A to B right now at the demand that, say, the supply chains or how much, especially with the pressures that the supply chain is experiencing right now, you're going to see massive investments and lots of people turning the screws on getting that online, because, and I think that's actually for the good, for the good of a lot of, and that's one of those things where, why do that? I do think that driving a truck as your livelihood is a dangerous thing. I think that there's better ways to re-educate people and get them into places that, again, this is coming from a place, like I've driven those trucks. I haven't driven a semi, but I've driven a truck that's half the size of a semi before for long periods of the day. And it's not a safe job. Driving in general, I think I've even heard somebody say, it's we're in this weird time where being behind the wheel as a human driving this thing going, 70, 80 miles an hour, it's so unsafe. And the faster we can get, computers to help us move ourselves and our things from A to B is it can come no faster, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's, I know that there's very heated debates about, how robots would prioritize other lives over, like if there's a crash that's imminent. That is a very real algorithm that
the child problem kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. What's the trolley problem, Jordan?
It's like some philosophical riddle, or not even riddle, but just like kind of like brain teaser. And it's like, all right, if you're the conductor of a train and there's 4 people on the track, but you can switch to a different track, but there's 1 person on that track, right? So either way, you're going to kill somebody. Do you do nothing and kill 4 people, or do you do something and kill 1 person?
Yeah. Like you have to make a conscious effort to kill them. Yeah. Which is,
exactly. Like it's, I don't know. I think most people would probably logically be like, well, you do less harm, you kill the 1 person, but even still, it's like, damn, but then you still got to pull that lever. It's kind of a wild concept. Yeah.
And does it make it easier that the lever is being pulled by a robot, and but there's, even if that robot is, just that robot, there's still, there's a human company behind it. I'll come back to that topic. I didn't necessarily have a good connection to the car thing, but the idea of like, zooming in and out, and I think it's important to see how things, at their most basic level function and how they scale. It's like thinking about, why music is so important to us, bringing it back to like kind of how we opened up the episode. It's, when we are nomadic tribes, you would, dance circles, you would, use music to storytell, you would do all these things. And then as you layer in technology and and as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, just seeing, okay, now those same stories are being told, but they're being told over streaming services or in music festivals or, and it's just, I guess thinking about, how things grow and transcend these generations is, not necessarily a point to it. I think it's just fun, like mental chewing gum. Just like why, asking yourself why more. Why do these things exist? Why are they here? Why is a car here? Oh, it's to move people from A to B. But also it's this idea of freedom. And so how free do you need to be? Where I don't know. It's kind of it's just interesting to think like what drives people and what is inspiring these decisions that they make in a personal or even professional sense.
Yeah. When you bring up this topic of freedom and you're talking about John Perkins and Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and I'm curious to get your thoughts of how free do you think we actually are today?
I think the United States does a really good job of creating the illusion of freedom. I think the United States does a very good job of making sure that the right, like specific people know that they are free and they can move about the world pretty unencumbered or in an unencumbered sense. Yeah. And I think for the longest time, that's kind of driven to something I was thinking about recently is, the United States is built on oppression, slavery, and it depended on a workforce that, they needed other people. And so I think that that idea and that theme has obviously made its way into modern day life through other, very kind of veiled ways and in very scary ways. And so again, coming from a straight white male, this is, or a white male in general, it's not like I understand that, this is, I don't necessarily have like strong grounds to, speak to the other perspectives. But yeah, so I'd say but even, are you even free if you know that the freedom that you're given is predicated on other people being oppressed? Like that's just, that's propaganda. I don't know. It's not a healthy form of freedom if that's what it is. I think that, the US is good at, sticking to the kind of rugged individualism and making sure that, certain liberties are protected. I don't know, but it's a messy place. And it's, in some ways I don't know if I think in general, like freedom is at least in a place like the United States where we are so diverse and a big, large melting pot of a lot of different cultures and ethnicities. And it's, whereas you compare us to, other countries throughout the world who are perceived as more free. I don't know, United States is a gigantic experiment that is currently, kind of hurting. So we'll see how it all kind of develops.
Yeah. I mean, where do you think we go from here realistically with our government? Candidly, like to me from the outside in, it looks like it's fucking falling apart at the seams.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, that's why I didn't get into politics. I think that's why business is a little bit more comfortable to me in general, and I'm not that to say I don't think about this. It's just, it's one of those things where you do recognize that technically, everyone's perspective is valid in their own way, but it's very hard to listen to some, like bigoted, misogynistic language being thrown out in our like highest levels of government. And even if they're not, and largely, I think a lot of the times they're not aware enough to understand that they're, doing what they do. Like they blame it on the constituents, but that's thinly veiled as listen, you know what you're doing, you know why. And I don't know where we go from here, Jordan, but I do know that getting more, people of color and more women into leadership positions will do our country a lot of good. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think you and I being both white males, I don't think we really should. We've proven that we can't necessarily build a collaborative and functioning democracy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, and nor should we, right? Like, I mean, it's ridiculous that was ever the case in the first place.
Yeah.
That's what people just somehow forget, right? Like they think all these, you talked about, the US being built on slavery and oppression, and like people tend to act like these things were so far away, or, the world is so different now. But I mean, it's not at all. Like, look at who's actually elected in politics. It's so high white male, percentage wise, like It's obviously gotten better, but you have the generation after generation of legacy of white males who own land getting all the power and consolidating that power, and then having the financial resources and the network to continue passing that power on generation after generation. You can understand why the system feels so rigged to so many people.
Yeah. I mean, I think I saw, like you mentioned, you saw a meme here or there. I saw a meme that was, even, the idea of a 70-plus-year-old person being a representative of the current day's like most important decisions being, but Biden is 70 plus. I just, two things come to mind there. They can never be that connected to, you're like that awkward uncle in the corner, like trying to relate to kids. Listen, you're never going to understand like what's truly going on. I mean, sure, you can have people who you could delegate to do research for you, and, you are ultimately making a decision, but also, why would you want to be a politician at that age? Like if you're 70 years old, like this can't be, you can't honestly want to be doing this right now. But, maybe that's why I'm not president. I don't have that hunger.
Yeah. But I think that's part of the problem, right? Is the entire structure of our government is such that to become president, you just have to have all the characteristics that make you an unfit president.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So we'll see. Have you read a little bit of, it's related, but have you read any Octavia Butler books?
I've not.
So Parabola of the Sower, and a buddy and I read it.
Parabola of color?
Parabola of the Sower, SOWER. And so this, it's pretty fascinating, pretty dystopian book. She, it's set in a place, it's set in LA. All of the communities are walled up communities. If you don't have a gun, you're largely, not going to survive in this type of world. The two major things like basically spurred the world to be what it is. It was this drug that makes people addicted to setting fires. And then the other thing is there's a large kind of pandemic that kind of made everybody kind of cloister up into these, again, it's kind of a Mad Maxian, visuals. And the reason I bring it up is that, the safest places in this type of, United States are on these corporate owned work camps, where you get a house, provided by the company. You have armed security provided by the company in this walled off, and then the most beautiful places that you can live. and anybody in between migrating, trying to get to these cities is putting their life at risk. And then the government, and another reason I bring it up is the Octavia Butler was so kind of prescient, and she predicted the rise of somebody like Trump, and saw that and the scary thing is that she pretty much verbatim predicted a lot of the rhetoric he would use to kind of rise to power. And so there's this kind of a populist figure who would lean on the religious right, and kind of scare people into falling into these traps. But anyway, so that's kind of influenced a little bit of my viewpoints. But the book is set, the main character in this book is this girl named Lauren Olamina, and she is a child of this scene, from a child of a pastor. And so she, in this kind of gnarly world, she's inventing a new religion that is all built around this kind of this idea that God is change, and the religion should be this idea of collaborating with your within your community and learning hard skills. And I don't know, it's a fascinating book to kind of read in a time like this, because you recognize how fragile societies are, and fragile, a lot of what we have in front of us is built on trust, built on mutual respect. And so if you see these start to kind of tatter, what does that turn into? So a little bit scary, but also it's never a bad thing to kind of put yourself into these. And that's what the power of books and the power of movies does for us, is just kind of allows us to enter into the imagination of another person, another very gifted person. And that is definitely who, what Octavia Butler did for me.
Yeah.
I mean, in the end, getting out of this pickle and bind we're in is going to require some really creative thinkers. And so.
Yeah, it was like Einstein that said something like, you can't solve a problem with the same level of thinking that created the problem.
Yeah, totally. Exactly.
So you were talking earlier about just mushrooms as an alternative plant protein. And, obviously we've talked about mushrooms before, just more broadly, and kind of some of the cooler, crazy things going on with them. And I'm curious, have you ever experimented with psychedelic mushrooms?
Yeah, Jordan, a couple times. Most recently, I had a little bit of time on my hands and was, just considering, hey, let's take a healthy dose and see where this goes. And with the all intention of making sure that all the trappings were there, and the setting and the set and the intentions. And it was a pretty wild ride. My first time ever was in my early 20s, and it was, largely visual, and there's a little bit of that kind of ego dissolution they talk about, but this time was hit me like a bag of bricks. And I think the major kind of lessons that I drew from it, without getting too detailed, was kind of related to what we were just talking about. Our realities and the things that we hold dear are, there's something that you should not take for granted. You should, if you're at a crossroads of, should I call my mom, or should I call my buddy that I haven't talked to in 5+ years, or 5+ years, probably too long, but 5 months, or hey, just tell people you're thinking about them, more often, and follow your instinct, follow your intuitions more, because I think that these are, little bits and messages that are coming from, sure, maybe they're just coming from your brain, but who knows? Like we've talked about, Jordan, it's this interconnected web of consciousness where, you need to respect that. And these things come from, all sorts of sources, and we're more interconnected than we realize, even if everything that we're doing on the outside, with creating more distance between ourselves through technology or avoiding people is growing ever present. I think that's also one of the benefits of something like the pandemic. Is coming out of it is going to be this, also obviously the war is pretty freaky, and so that's just kind of throwing a curveball in all this. But I think people are going to appreciate in-person engagement so much more. You're not just going to be sitting and tied to your phone and assuming that that's going to give you the social connection that your brain needs. Like nobody's fooling themselves and they're flipping death scrolling through Instagram. Like that's not the same as, I mean, even this, I'm staring at a, desktop wallpaper of your flat little face, but I know that you're so much more animated and a, beautiful being yourself when, we're bullshitting and chatting in person. And, so it's, I was even talking to my mom about that, sure that the flat, Zoom is, it's a means to an ends right now, but it would be cool, kind of bringing it full circle into if we were to be able to have, more of a VR experience. Okay. That's like getting closer. If you can digitize your facial features and your responses, and it's not this creepy, kind of deep fake version of yourself. I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway, point is, I think that coming out of it will be a lot more dialed into, things that, fire off dopamine in our heads and endorphins and make sure that, we're taking care of ourselves in an authentic way.
Yeah. I think it'd be cool if there's eventually like phones that you can call and like you have a hologram of your body pop up like in Star Wars or something.
Yeah, definitely. I know. I just finished up the Boba Fett. I love that stuff. And that's the thing. It's just like makes you appreciate nature so much more because you see all these, weird beings that came out of someone's head. But if we take creatures on our earth for granted but like you look at a giraffe, that shit is weird. We're just yeah. Literally any animal, name it. It's weird. We just happen to have the perspective of being used to it, so.
Right. And I think like that's what, I don't know, to me, like the whole idea of like good and evil, right, is like, I think it's a little bit simplistic, right? And like a lot of the time for me, like evil is really more about like ignorance or not being able to recognize how incredible what's right in front of you really is.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big lesson, and I'm more early on that side of things, but recognizing that there's no good or bad, like whatever happens to you in life, it's, even if it's perceived from a societal standpoint as good, it may not be. You have no idea. Maybe it's good. Maybe it's bad. Who knows? Thanks,
well,
man.
And I totally agree with that. And for me, one of the most profound mindset shifts that has resulted through my usage of psychedelics is just my conception of death and of my soul has completely changed. Where like I no longer think of it like I just know part of me is concerned that my consciousness won't go on after this life, right? Like what is that going to look like? I have no fucking idea. And maybe in true consciousness time isn't linear, whatever, but point is like I just don't think that this is all there is. And so when you start to think with that perspective, like these things that are seen as like obviously people being like horrible things happen all the time, people are taken before their time and all of these things. But if you start to think about just your soul's journey not being limited to this one physical life, and there's so much more, and it's all just about the experience for your soul, over infinity and eternity, then you can start to have a very different perspective on those things that are quote unquote bad or evil at face value.
Yeah, for sure. And like we kind of talked about early on, you you respect other lives more, because there could be like a long lost friend, that cow that you put the VR on, or that person put the VR on is, that's, could be a cousin of yours. I know we were talking about this. I'm just curious, and you don't have to, put this in, but I'm curious how, we were talking about a lot of the research and a lot of the readings in this area lend to, going down a lot of deep rabbit holes, and, how when does something really stick, and when do I know there's a lot of different paths that ultimately converge on this like higher form of consciousness. So, what generally works for you personally, Jordan?
So you're saying, how do I know, like, when I've like hit a rabbit hole that I believe is true?
Yeah, I'd say, or maybe rabbit hole is an insensitive way to describe it. I'd say, when people, bring up consciousness or UAPs or psychedelics, I'd say historically people would be like, like kind of glaze over. They wouldn't, if they're not already on that path, it'd be hard to get them on that path. And I know you and I've been in situations where, we're trying to like bring people along for the journey and be open-minded. So just kind of open-ended. Yeah, exactly. So
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's gotten easier over time since I've stopped trying to force it on people, right? And like, Ram Dass even talks about this idea of like, everyone's on their own soul's journey. Like who are you to tell them or to force, your views about consciousness on anyone? Like all you can do is be a breath of fresh air when people want to come up for air.
Yeah. Yeah. And you'll know, when somebody has their ear and heart open to these new ideas and concepts.
Yeah. But it's a tightrope, right? Because for me, like, it's just been so meaningful and it's so exciting and so interesting. But it's like, to your point, if someone isn't at a place where they're ready to hear it, or it's just frankly just not interesting to them, then you got to they respect that. But I go back with that, a lot back and forth too, just even with like family members and some of my friends, just like, it's hard because you don't want to lose those relationships, but I also want to respect, like, hey, look, if we're just not interested in the same things at this time, like, then this time we'll be resonating at our own frequencies, and we'll link up at some point again in the future. Like, it's not, so it's a delicate balancing act that I try to navigate that.
For sure. Cool, man. Well, thanks for doing this. Thanks for inviting me.
Dude, this was a blast, man. Thanks for coming on. This is so much fun. Thanks everyone for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. In this discussion, Alex talked about John Perkins' book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and the impact it had on his perception of America's intelligence agencies. I wanted to dive further into this book as it had a huge impact on me as well. Reading this book a few years ago was the first time I fundamentally started to reshape my views of the CIA and other clandestine services like the NSA. Like most American boys, I grew up idolizing James Bond and viewing spies as the epitome of patriotism and masculinity, even going so far as to apply for the CIA when coming out of college. Yet as I grew older, I started to question why our culture would want young men to glorify a man like James Bond, someone who goes around assassinating people with no consideration for due process, who treats women as objects and glorifies promiscuity, violence, and domination. Then after I read Perkins' book, I started to recognize the true nature of our intelligence agencies and how different that is relative to the one portrayed by Hollywood. That these agents aren't foiling endless terrorist plots in defense of the American and British homelands. Rather, much more truthfully, they're serving as agents of treachery working for the benefit of multinational corporations. And here I'd like to discuss the life of John Perkins and 3 concepts which he introduced me to: corporatocracy, economic hitmen, and jackals. Perkins graduated from business school in 1968 and was recruited by a friend of his wife's father, an executive of the NSA who they knew as Uncle Frank. Uncle Frank profiled Perkins with his strong understanding of economics as an ideal candidate for the NSA. Perkins first spent time in the Peace Corps in Ecuador, where he met the vice president of international consulting firm Chaz T. Main. This VP concurrently acted as a liaison for the NSA. Coming out of the Peace Corps, Perkins underwent clandestine training to work for Maine as an economic hitman, or EHM. And this is absurdly what they called the actual position at the time, although EHMs now go by less on-the-nose titles like chief economist. In his role as an EHM, Perkins' job was basically to convince presidents of countries with resources that our corporations wanted, namely oil, to accept huge loans from organizations like the World Bank. These loans would then be used to build huge infrastructure projects like power plants. Almost all of the money from these loans would be used to hire American corporations to build the infrastructure, with the rest going to a few wealthy families within those countries. Almost none of the economic benefit accreted to the locals in these countries like Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Saudi Arabia. But of course, the poor get left holding the bag. You see, the EHM's responsibility was to create fabulous financial projections that had no chance of playing out once the construction projects were finished. These countries would then be saddled with huge sums of unpayable debt. Debt which the US government would use as leverage to force the leaders of these governments to sell us oil and other resources cheaply, to vote with us on important United Nations matters, and to allow us to build military bases in their backyard. Perkins began to recognize that the global financial and governmental infrastructure was in fact run by what he termed the corporatocracy. He defined the corporatocracy as a vast network of corporations, banks, colluding governments, media outlets, and the rich and powerful people tied to them. Perkins went on to explain that individuals go deeply into debt. Our country and its financial henchmen at the World Bank and its sister institutions coerce other countries to go deeply into debt. Debt enslaves us, and it enslaves those countries. Importantly, Perkins was employed by Maine, never directly by the NSA or any other intelligence agency. This decision came after Kermit Roosevelt helped to orchestrate a coup of democratically elected Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in the 1950s. Kermit, the grandson of President Teddy Roosevelt, was a CIA agent sent to organize a series of street riots and violent demonstrations against Mossadegh. This coup was orchestrated because Mossadegh had demanded a fair share of oil revenues go to the Iranian people instead of just oil companies like British Petroleum. The CIA-led coup was successful, and Mossadegh was replaced by pro-American Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. While this was regarded as a huge success within the CIA at the time, the agency recognized it would have had egg on its face had Roosevelt been caught, and so decided to start outsourcing these acts of treachery to international corporations like Maine. That way, if agents were caught, their actions could be attributed to corporate greed rather than official government policy. 26 years later, in 1979, this CIA success story turned to abject failure when the Shah was pushed out of his country, the US embassy in Iran was overrun, and the leader of the Iranian Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, was named Supreme Leader of Iran. Much of the destabilized environment in the Middle East today and the mistrust between the US and Middle Eastern nations can be traced back to these events. But alas, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the intelligence agencies viewed Iran as a huge win and looked to replicate Roosevelt's strategy in order to develop a new, more subtle form of imperialism. Many of the target countries were oil-rich, developing nations around the world. Perkins' career as an EHM took him to places like Indonesia, Panama, Ecuador, and very importantly, Saudi Arabia, where he would convince the leaders of those nations to take on huge sums of debt. His team's work in Saudi Arabia, known as the Saudi Arabian money laundering affair, served as a model for future EHM deals, including the one that ultimately failed in Iraq in the 1980s and led to the first Gulf War. As part of the affair, the Saudi royal family agreed to invest billions of dollars of oil income in U.S. securities and to allow the U.S. Department of Treasury to use the interest from those investments to hire U.S. firms to build power and water systems, highways, ports, and cities in the kingdom. In exchange, the U.S. guaranteed that the royal family continued to rule Saudi Arabia. During his career, Perkins began to suffer from deep depression, guilt, and the realization that money and power had trapped him at Maine. This led to his resignation in 1980. The following year, Perkins was deeply troubled when democratically elected leaders from Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and Panama, Omar Torrijos, died in fiery plane crashes. Both men had incurred the wrath of Washington due to their anti-oil platforms and resistance to U.S. control of the Panama Canal, respectively. Perkins notes that the crashes had all the markings of CIA assassinations. These assassins, also known as jackals, have used murder as a final maneuver time and again to enforce the agenda of the corporatocracy when EHM efforts failed. The murder of these two men, whom Perkins respected and thought of as kindred spirits, led him to start writing Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He started the book 4 more times over the next 20 years, each time driven by world events: the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989, the First Gulf War, Somalia, and the rise of Osama bin Laden. However, threats or bribes always convinced him to stop until he finally went forward with the publication in 2004. So then these honest but uncomfortable depiction of historical events naturally leads one to question the depth of deception within the intelligence agencies. Our jackals are willing to assassinate foreign leaders like Honduran President Manuel Zelaya for wanting to raise the minimum wage from 6.5 cents an hour. Are we really so naive to think that they'd resist domestic espionage? Maybe we've just been fed, through media and entertainment, a lot of what can only be described as propaganda. After all, it's well known that former CIA Director Alan Dulles and the author of the James Bond novels, Ian Fleming, were close friends. There's even tantalizing hints, albeit nothing conclusive, that by the early 1960s, the CIA was directly trying to influence Fleming's coverage of the agency and his portrayal of the practice of intelligence more broadly. Then you look at someone like Edward Snowden, who exposed widespread, illegal information gathering on U.S. citizens by the NSA. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled 7 years later that the NSA had in fact been illegally collecting millions of Americans' telephone records in direct violation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, actions that may well have been unconstitutional. Yet Snowden still remains in exile in Russia. Why? If we truly have a system that protects whistleblowers, how can we possibly justify this? When you take a step back and look at our intelligence agencies, it becomes increasingly clear that something is deeply broken. When the richest 85 people in the world have more wealth than the poorest 3.5 billion people in the world, something is deeply broken. That means the top 0.0000001% have more wealth than the bottom 50%. What the fuck? We should not have this monstrosity of a corporatocracy with their tentacles in every element of society. We should not have this corrupt economic system held together by a deeply tangled web of 3-letter secret agencies, acting with impunity from domestic and international law, and taking control of an ever-increasing list of civil liberties. Just last week, the Department of Homeland Security announced it has set up a new board to tackle disinformation. The government and their conduits in the media will certainly hammer a message that this is being used to stop acts of violence and to counter disinformation coming from Russia. But we have to go deeper in our thinking and recognize what this will truly create. We are effectively abdicating ownership of open discourse and allowing government agencies to decide for us what constitutes truth. Let's not mince words here. This is a thinly guised excuse for censorship and an infringement on our right to free speech. Guys, wake up. The DHS will be able to censor whoever they want for whatever reason and claim it's being done to prevent violence and disinformation. But censorship, by definition, removes the evidence of what's been said. So how will we possibly be able to hold them accountable for the alleged falsehoods they choose to call disinformation? It's time we stand up, say that enough is enough, and demand far greater transparency from our clandestine services. We deserve a government that works for the betterment of people all over the world, instead of one fattening the pocketbooks of a few multinational corporations and the powerful elites who own them. We deserve a world that is built on a life economy instead of a death economy.